Welcome. Today we're diving into a powerful and often untold moment in history, 1965, the promise Bumpy Johnson made to Malcolm X, and how it forever changed the black community. This story connects the streets of Harlem to the heart of the civil rights movement, blending truth, power, and consequence. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value deeply researched, fact-checked history built from real records, eyewitness accounts, and verified sources. Subscribe now, because uncovering true data like this takes serious work, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Harlem in the early 1960s was a community standing at a crossroads, shaped by deep cultural pride, but weighed down by systemic neglect. It was a place where black excellence thrived in music, art, and intellectual life, yet everyday residents faced overcrowded housing, underfunded schools, aggressive policing, and limited economic opportunity. The neighborhood carried the legacy of the Harlem Renaissance. That legacy now clashed with frustration, as promises of equality made after World War II had largely gone unfulfilled. Unemployment and poverty hit Harlem harder than many other parts of New York City. Jobs that once sustained working-class families were disappearing, and discriminatory hiring practices kept many black residents locked out of better-paying work. Landlords exploited tenants, charging high rents for deteriorating buildings, while city officials often ignored complaints. These conditions created an atmosphere where anger simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for leadership, direction, or a spark. At the same time, Harlem was one of the most politically conscious black communities in America. Street corners, barbershops, churches, and social clubs buzzed with debates about civil rights, black nationalism, self-defense, and economic independence. National movements were not distant ideas here. They were personal, discussed daily by people who felt the consequences of injustice firsthand. Harlem was not just observing history, it was actively shaping it. This environment also allowed alternative forms of power to exist alongside formal politics. Because institutions often failed the community, informal leaders filled the gaps. Figures who could protect businesses, resolve disputes, or keep a level of order gained influence and respect, even if they operated outside the law. In Harlem, authority did not come solely from City Hall or the police department. It came from who could actually get things done. Malcolm X emerged as one of the most influential voices in this atmosphere. His speeches resonated deeply with Harlem residents because he spoke directly to their lived reality. He addressed police brutality, economic exploitation, and the psychological damage of racism with a blunt honesty that many felt mainstream civil rights leaders avoided. Harlem was not just an audience for Malcolm X, it was his base, a place where his ideas found both support and fierce debate. Tensions between the black community and law enforcement were especially high during this period. Incidents of police violence often sparked protests and sometimes unrest, reinforcing the belief that the system was designed to control rather than protect black neighborhoods. Many residents felt they were living under occupation, which further eroded trust in official authority and pushed people to look elsewhere for safety and justice. By the early 1960s, Harlem had become a pressure cooker of hope, anger, resilience, and determination. It was a place where change felt both necessary and inevitable. But the path forward was uncertain. This was the Harlem in which powerful figures moved carefully, alliances mattered, and promises carried real weight, setting the stage for decisions that would echo far beyond the neighborhood itself. Bumpy Johnson was far more complex than the label of Harlem gangster suggests. Born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in 1905 in South Carolina, he grew up witnessing racial violence at a young age, including the lynching of a close family friend. Experience shaped his worldview early, planting a deep mistrust of authority and a fierce belief in self-protection. When he later moved to Harlem as a teenager, he entered a world where survival often depended on strength, reputation, and alliances. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson rose through the ranks of the underground economy during a time when organized crime filled gaps left by systemic exclusion. Legitimate opportunities for black men were severely limited, and illegal enterprises became one of the few paths to power and financial stability. Bumpy proved to be intelligent, disciplined, and strategic, qualities that separated him from many others in the criminal world. He was known not just for violence, but for his ability to think several steps ahead. Unlike many crime figures, Bumpy Johnson had a deep respect for knowledge and culture. He read extensively, enjoyed poetry, and was known to quote philosophers and historical figures. This intellectual side surprised people who only saw his street reputation. It also allowed him to communicate across different worlds, criminal, political, and cultural, making him a rare bridge between Harlem's underground and its intellectual elite. Bumpy's power in Harlem was not solely based on fear. Many residents viewed him as a protector rather than a predator. He intervened in disputes, helped struggling families, paid legal fees, and ensured that certain lines were not crossed within the community. While his money often came from illegal sources, his generosity earned him loyalty and respect, especially from people who felt abandoned by city institutions. His relationship with law enforcement was complicated and adversarial. Bumpy spent nearly half of his adult life in prison, yet even behind bars, his influence remained strong. Prison did not break him. Instead, it sharpened his discipline and reinforced his belief that the system was fundamentally stacked against black men like him. Each release only seemed to strengthen his resolve to control his environment rather than be controlled by it. Bumpy Johnson also maintained strict rules about how Harlem should be treated. He opposed random violence, discouraged drug sales to children, and resisted outside criminal groups that threatened the community's stability. While this did not make him a moral figure, it revealed a code, one shaped by survival, pride, and a sense of responsibility to Harlem as his home. By the early 1960s, Bumpy Johnson was more than a crime boss. He was a symbol of black autonomy in a city that offered very little of it. He represented a form of power that existed outside official systems, one that many Harlem residents understood even if they didn't fully approve of it. This unique position made him someone whose promises mattered and whose decisions could ripple far beyond the streets he controlled. After leaving the Nation of Islam in 1964, Malcolm X entered one of the most dangerous and transformative periods of his life. The break was not just ideological but deeply personal. severing ties with an organization that had defined his public identity for over a decade. Suddenly, Malcolm was without the institutional protection that once surrounded him, and he was fully aware that this separation made him vulnerable. Former allies became critics, and in some cases, enemies. Freed from the strict doctrine of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm's thinking began to evolve rapidly. He no longer framed the struggle for black liberation solely as a racial conflict within America, but increasingly as a global human rights issue. His travels to Africa, the Middle East, and Europe exposed him to revolutionary leaders and newly independent nations, reshaping his understanding of power, solidarity, and resistance. These experiences softened some of his earlier absolutist views while strengthening his commitment to justice. Malcolm also began building new organizations, including Muslim Mosque, Inc., and the Organization of Afro-American Unity. These groups were designed to unite black people across religious and ideological lines, something he had previously rejected. This shift marked a significant change in his approach. He now sought collaboration rather than separation, believing unity was essential to confronting systemic oppression. However, these organizations lacked funding, security, and infrastructure, making them fragile in their early stages. At the same time, Malcolm faced constant surveillance from government agencies. The FBI and NYPD monitored his movements, phone calls, and speeches closely, viewing him as a potential threat to national stability. This pressure added another layer of danger to his life, as law enforcement interest often intensified existing conflicts rather than neutralizing them. Malcolm knew he was being watched. He refused to silence himself. Threats against Malcolm became more frequent and explicit during this period. His home was firebombed just days before his assassination, a clear warning that his life was in imminent danger. Despite this, Malcolm continued to speak publicly, insisting that fear could not dictate his actions. He believed retreat would not only endanger his mission, but also betray the people who saw him as a voice of truth. Financial strain further complicated his situation. Without the backing of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm struggled to support his family and sustain his political work. He relied on speaking engagements and donations, often traveling constantly to keep his movement alive. This instability made it even harder to secure consistent protection or plan long-term strategies. By early 1965, Malcolm X stood at a critical juncture, intellectually liberated but physically exposed, visionary yet isolated. He was redefining his message at the very moment his enemies multiplied. This combination of transformation and vulnerability made the weeks leading up to his death some of the most consequential in his life, setting the stage for the promises, decisions, and consequences that would soon follow. The meeting between Malcolm X and Bumpy Johnson did not happen by accident. It was the result of Harlem's unique power dynamics, bringing two very different kinds of leaders into the same orbit. By the early 1960s, Malcolm X had become one of the most visible and polarizing figures in Harlem, drawing large crowds and intense scrutiny. Bumpy Johnson, though operating mostly behind the scenes, was deeply aware of anyone whose presence could shift the balance of influence in the neighborhood. In Harlem, when someone gained that much attention, the paths of formal leadership and street power were bound to cross. Malcolm X understood Harlem better than most outsiders realized. He knew that speeches alone could not protect a movement, especially one challenging entrenched systems of power. While Malcolm did not glorify street life or criminality, he was pragmatic about survival. He recognized that the same systems that oppressed black communities also created alternative power structures, and ignoring them could be dangerous. A meeting with someone like Bumpy Johnson was less about alliance and more about understanding the realities on the ground. Bumpy Johnson, for his part, viewed Malcolm X with a mix of respect and caution. He saw Malcolm as someone who genuinely cared about black people and spoke with an authenticity that resonated in Harlem. At the same time, Bumpy was aware that Malcolm's growing influence could bring unwanted attention, violence, or disruption to the neighborhood. For Bumpy, protecting Harlem meant knowing who was moving within it and what consequences their presence might bring. When they finally met, the conversation was reportedly direct and serious, not ceremonial or friendly. There was no grand performance of power, just two men who understood the risks surrounding Malcolm's work. Malcolm spoke openly about the threats against his life and the hostility he faced after leaving the Nation of Islam. He did not ask for criminal favors or public displays of loyalty. Instead, he made it clear that his goal was to continue speaking without causing harm to Harlem's people. Bumpy listened carefully, weighing what Malcolm represented against the realities of street politics. He knew that violence against Malcolm would not just be a personal tragedy, but a destabilizing event for the entire community. Harlem was already under pressure from police, federal surveillance, and economic neglect. The assassination of such a prominent figure within its borders could trigger chaos, retaliation, and further crackdowns. What made this meeting significant was the mutual recognition of responsibility. Malcolm understood that words carried consequences. Bumpy understood that power, legal or illegal, came with obligations. Their conversation reflected a shared concern for Harlem's future, even though they arrived at that concern from vastly different paths. It was less about agreement and more about boundaries, respect, and awareness. This meeting became a quiet but crucial moment in Harlem's history. It symbolized a rare intersection between revolutionary politics and street authority, united by a common understanding of risk. Though little was publicly documented, the implications of that conversation would later take on deeper meaning, especially after Malcolm X's death, when questions about protection, promises, and responsibility came sharply into focus. The promise made between Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X was not announced publicly, written down, or witnessed by crowds. It was the kind of understanding that existed quietly, shaped by necessity rather than ceremony. In Harlem, promises like this were often verbal and deeply personal, carrying weight because of who made them, not because of any formal authority. This was not about ideology or friendship. It was about responsibility and consequences. X was fully aware of the danger surrounding him in early 1965. He knew that his split from the Nation of Islam had placed him in a vulnerable position, and that threats against his life were no longer abstract. When he spoke to Bumpy Johnson, Malcolm did not ask to be shielded from criticism or conflict. Instead, he expressed concern about what might happen to Harlem if violence followed him. His fear was not only for himself, but for the community that would bear the aftermath. Bumpy Johnson's promise was rooted in his role as a guardian of order within Harlem. While he could not control forces outside the neighborhood, he had influence over what happened inside it. The understanding was simple, but powerful. Malcolm would not be touched in Harlem without consequences. This did not mean constant visible protection or public enforcement. It meant that anyone considering harm would have to reckon with the response it would provoke. For Bumpy, making such a promise was not taken lightly. His word carried weight in the streets, and breaking it would weaken his authority. At the same time, honoring it meant potentially inviting conflict with powerful groups or individuals. Yet Bumpy understood that allowing a figure like Malcolm X to be murdered in Harlem without response would signal weakness and invite further instability. The promise also reflected a shared belief that Harlem should not be a battlefield for outside wars. Malcolm's political struggles, rivalries, and enemies extended far beyond New York, but Harlem was home to families, businesses, and everyday people trying to survive. Both men understood that violence there would ripple outward, harming those with no part in the conflict. Protecting Harlem's stability became the unspoken priority. Importantly, this promise was not about aligning Malcolm's movement with street power. Bumpy did not seek influence over Malcolm's message, nor did Malcolm compromise his principles. The agreement respected boundaries. Malcolm would continue his work, and Bumpy would ensure that Harlem did not become the place where blood was spilled without consequence. After Malcolm X's assassination, the promise took on a different meaning. While it could not save Malcolm's life, it shaped how the community interpreted what happened next. In the silence and grief that followed, many believed that Harlem would not simply forget. The promise became symbolic of protection offered, of responsibility acknowledged, and of a line drawn that would influence Harlem's response and memory long after 1965. The contrast between street power and political power was especially clear in Harlem during the 1960s. Political power operated through speeches, organizations, protests, and appeals to law and public opinion. It relied on visibility and legitimacy, but it often moved slowly and faced resistance from institutions designed to maintain the status quo. For many black communities, political power promised change, but rarely delivered immediate protection or relief from daily struggles. Street power, on the other hand, functioned through presence, reputation, and control of territory. It did not depend on elections or public approval, but on the ability to enforce consequences. In neighborhoods like Harlem, where trust in government and police was low, street power filled the gaps left by failing institutions. It offered a form of order, imperfect and morally complex, but real and immediate. Malcolm X represented political power in its most radical and uncompromising form. His influence came from ideas, language, and his ability to awaken consciousness. He challenged systems openly and demanded structural change, even when it made him a target. However, political power made him visible and vulnerable. His voice reached far beyond Harlem, but it could not physically shield him from threats. Bumpy Johnson embodied street power shaped by lived reality. His authority was not symbolic, it was practical. People listened to him because they knew ignoring him had consequences. Yet his power was limited by geography. He could influence Harlem, but not the broader national or ideological battles Malcolm was fighting. Street power could control space. It could not rewrite laws or transform systems. The interaction between these two forms of power revealed both their strengths and weaknesses. Political power without protection risked martyrdom. Street power without vision risked stagnation. Each addressed different needs within the black community, and neither was sufficient on its own. This tension was not a conflict between good and evil, but between survival and transformation. What made their understanding significant was the acknowledgement that both forms of power mattered. Malcolm did not dismiss street authority as meaningless, and Bumpy did not dismiss political struggle as unrealistic. They recognized that liberation required both immediate stability and long-term change, even if those goals sometimes pulled in different directions. This balance, or imbalance, between street power and political power shaped Harlem's response to crisis. It influenced how leaders operated, how violence was contained or unleashed, and how the community navigated moments of loss. In 1965, this dynamic stood at the center of Harlem's reality, quietly shaping decisions whose impact would be felt long after the moment passed. 1965, the threat surrounding Malcolm X had escalated to a deadly reality. His outspoken criticism of the Nation of Islam, coupled with his rapidly growing influence as an independent activist, made him a target for both former allies and external adversaries. The rhetoric against him had intensified, and harassment had become routine, from surveillance and intimidation to overt acts of violence. Each day he continued his public work, he knowingly placed himself in grave danger. Malcolm was constantly aware of the precariousness of his situation. His home had already been firebombed, and he had received numerous threats against his life. Yet, despite this, he maintained a public presence, attending meetings, giving speeches, and traveling to galvanize support for black empowerment. He understood that retreating or going into hiding would slow the momentum of his movement and weaken the message he had fought so hard to develop. The climate of fear was compounded by uncertainty about whom he could trust. Former allies in the Nation of Islam had become adversaries, and law enforcement agencies that were supposed to protect citizens often viewed him as a threat. Even those who supported his ideas could not guarantee safety. This isolation left Malcolm vulnerable, as he lacked a formal security structure capable of countering the very real physical threats he faced. His assassination, when it finally occurred on February 21, 1965, was sudden and violent, yet tragically predictable given the mounting hostility surrounding him. He was killed while speaking at the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan, a location in the heart of his own community, a space that should have been safe. The event sent shockwaves through Harlem and the nation, highlighting the fragility of political activism in a society unwilling to protect its most outspoken voices. The impact of Malcolm's assassination went far beyond the immediate loss of a leader. It instilled fear in communities and organizations, sending a warning to other activists about the dangers of challenging entrenched systems of power. It also created a vacuum of leadership, leaving Harlem and the broader civil rights movement to reckon with how to continue the fight without one of its most dynamic voices. Bumpy Johnson's involvement during this time is crucial to understanding the Harlem response. While he could not prevent Malcolm's assassination, his earlier promise highlighted the tension between street authority and political activism. Bumpy's ability to influence Harlem's stability and maintain some degree of order demonstrated the limits and possibilities of localized power in protecting a national figure whose enemies extended far beyond the neighborhood. In the weeks and months that followed, Malcolm X's death became a catalyst for reflection, organization, and resilience within Harlem. The community mourned, but they also understood that the structures of protection and power Bumpy represented were vital for navigating life in a world where activism and survival were inseparable. His assassination underscored the high stakes of black leadership and the precarious balance between influence, visibility, and safety in a turbulent era. Bumpy Johnson's reaction to Malcolm X's assassination was a mix of grief, anger, and strategic calculation. Though he had promised to protect Malcolm in Harlem, the crime was carried out in a public space within the city he controlled, highlighting both the limits of his power and the complexities of the threats Malcolm faced. Bumpy understood that while he could influence the streets of Harlem, he could not control the larger forces, internal rivalries, extremist factions, or government surveillance that ultimately targeted Malcolm. Despite the tragedy, Bumpy moved quickly to stabilize the neighborhood. He understood that violence in response to Malcolm's death could spiral out of control, endangering ordinary residents and undermining the community's fragile sense of order. His priority was not vengeance for its own sake, but maintaining a level of peace and protecting Harlem from descending into chaos. This measured approach demonstrated his deep understanding of community dynamics and the responsibilities that came with his street authority. Bumpy also reached out quietly to key figures in Harlem's activist circles to reassure them that the neighborhood would remain safe and that retaliation would be controlled. His influence allowed him to mediate tensions, keeping rival factions from exploiting Malcolm's death to expand their own power. By doing so, he prevented the assassination from triggering immediate internecine violence, preserving a semblance of stability during a period of mourning and uncertainty. At the same time, Bumpy's response reflected a deep sense of personal responsibility. Even if he could not prevent the killing, he had made a promise, and his honor required that he act decisively in the aftermath. This sense of duty was not rooted in sentimentality alone. It was practical and symbolic. By demonstrating control and moral accountability, he reinforced the notion that Harlem's leaders, official and unofficial, could be trusted to protect the community's integrity. The assassination also prompted Bumpy to reassess threats to other prominent figures in Harlem. He increased vigilance over community leaders and activists, ensuring that no similar tragedy would catch the neighborhood entirely off guard. Surveillance, Intelligence gathering and strategic placement of allies became a quiet but vital part of how Bumpy operated, underscoring the blend of street power and protective responsibility he maintained. Bumpy's actions following Malcolm X's death sent a clear message to the wider criminal and political networks. Harlem would not become a lawless battlefield where anyone could act with impunity. His reputation, already formidable, was further reinforced by how he managed the aftermath. He proved that street authority could act as a stabilizing force in moments when formal institutions failed to provide security. Ultimately, Bumpy Johnson's reaction to Malcolm X's assassination exemplified the difficult balancing act of power, protection, and principle in Harlem. He could not undo the tragedy, but he shaped the community's response, preserving order, safeguarding leaders, and demonstrating that influence, when exercised wisely, could mitigate chaos. In this way, his actions extended the meaning of his promise and left a lasting imprint on how Harlem navigated the loss of one of its most important figures. Bumpy Johnson's role in protecting Harlem activists went far beyond simply managing immediate threats. It was about creating a network of informal security and influence that allowed community leaders to operate in a hostile environment. Activists, organizers, and even local politicians relied on his reputation and strategic oversight to carry out their work without being derailed by violent rivalries or external pressures. In a time when formal law enforcement often ignored or actively undermined Black communities, Bumpy's intervention provided a rare form of tangible protection. He understood that activism in Harlem was not just ideological, it was physical. Public meeting speeches and demonstrations could easily attract retaliation from adversaries who wanted to silence the growing voice of Black empowerment. Bumpy's presence, even when unseen, acted as a deterrent. Potential threats knew that disrupting Harlem without considering his influence could provoke serious consequences, giving activists a measure of confidence to continue their work. Bumpy also acted as a mediator between different factions within Harlem. Rival groups, whether criminal or political, could have exploited Malcolm X's death to assert dominance or spread fear. Instead, Bumpy leveraged his authority to keep these factions in check, negotiating boundaries and preventing escalation. This kind of behind-the-scenes management ensured that activists could focus on community, building and political work rather than constantly defending themselves from internal chaos. He often provided resources and guidance to activists in subtle ways. This might include arranging safe spaces for meetings, offering intelligence about potential threats, or facilitating introductions to influential figures who could aid their causes. By doing so, he created a quiet support system that strengthened Harlem's political and social networks without drawing public attention to himself or compromising his own position. Bumpy's protective role also extended to mentoring younger leaders. He recognized that the next generation needed both guidance and security to continue the struggle for Black empowerment. Through his example, he taught them the importance of strategy, patience, and knowing how to navigate complex networks of power, both formal and informal. These lessons helped cultivate leaders who could survive and thrive despite the dangers surrounding them. At the same time, Bumpy's approach reflected a clear moral code. He protected those who worked to uplift the community, but did not tolerate reckless or self-serving behavior that endangered others. Activists who respected Harlem's stability and the community's welfare could rely on his support, while those who threatened it were dealt with firmly. This selective enforcement strengthened his credibility and reinforced the principle that street power, when guided responsibly, could serve as a stabilizing force. Ultimately, Bumpy Johnson's efforts to protect Harlem activists created a bridge between grassroots movements and the realities of life in the neighborhood. He may not have been a formal leader, but his actions allowed community organizers to operate more safely, preserved the integrity of Harlem's social networks, and ensured that the legacy of figures like Malcolm X could continue to inspire action without being immediately extinguished by violence or intimidation. The promise Bumpy Johnson made and his subsequent actions contributed to a profound shift in how the black community in Harlem organized itself during the mid-1960s. Before this period, activism often occurred in isolated pockets, with individuals or small groups working independently and lacking centralized coordination. The presence of a figure like Bumpy, who exercised influence over the streets and understood the stakes of community stability, highlighted the importance of bridging political activism with local authority to protect progress. This shift became evident in the way activists began to work more strategically. They learned that public efforts needed to be supported by an understanding of local dynamics, including the informal networks that shaped daily life. By observing how Bumpy managed threats and mediated conflicts, community leaders saw the value of combining grassroots organization with the pragmatic realities of Harlem's social environment. The recognition of these informal power structures helped activists plan events, protests, and initiatives with a higher degree of security and impact. The assassination of Malcolm X further accelerated this change. Leaders realized that reliance on ideology or institutional support alone was insufficient for sustaining movements in a hostile environment. The community's approach shifted toward alliances, both overt and discreet, that could provide protection, resources, and information. Bumpy's role exemplified how local authority could complement political activism, encouraging a more nuanced understanding of power and survival within the black community. This period also saw a heightened emphasis on unity within Harlem. Rival groups and factions that had previously operated in competition began to recognize that collaboration, or at least non-interference, was essential for maintaining the neighborhood's stability and ensuring that collective goals could be pursued. The balance between respecting Bumpy's influence and advancing broader political objectives created a template for coordinated action that extended beyond individual agendas. Community meetings and grassroots organizing began to incorporate security considerations and informal alliances as a standard practice. Activists took into account who controlled certain areas, who could guarantee safe passage, and how to communicate without triggering conflict. This practical integration of street intelligence into activism marked a significant evolution in community organization, allowing efforts to be both ambitious and sustainable. The long term impact of this shift was significant. By learning to navigate both formal and informal power structures, Harlem's black community developed resilience that allowed it to withstand external pressures while continuing to pursue social, political, economic goals. Leaders who emerged during this period carried forward lessons about strategic coordination, alliance building, and balancing visibility with protection, skills that would influence activism for decades. Ultimately, the shift in community organization driven by Bumpy Johnson's influence and his promise to Malcolm X demonstrated that change was not only about speeches, protests, or policy. It was also about survival, strategy, and solidarity. Harlem learned that protecting the community, empowering leaders, and coordinating action were inseparable elements of lasting impact, shaping the trajectory of black activism far beyond the events of 1965. The long-term impact of the promise Bumpy Johnson made to Malcolm X extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of 1965, influencing the way Harlem and other black communities viewed leadership, protection, and collective responsibility. While the promise could not save Malcolm's life, it created a model for how informal authority could intersect with political activism to preserve the safety and stability of a community under pressure. This understanding reshaped local leadership dynamics in Harlem for years to come. One of the most significant effects was the recognition that power could be exercised responsibly outside formal institutions. Residents saw that figures like Bumpy Johnson, despite operating in the underworld, could play a constructive role by enforcing order, mediating conflicts, and protecting activists. This challenged conventional notions of authority, encouraging a broader acceptance of diverse forms of leadership that were rooted in accountability to the community rather than legal or political titles. The promise also reinforced the importance of community solidarity. Harlem became increasingly aware that survival and progress required collaboration between different sectors of society, activists, intellectuals, residents, and even figures with street authority. This approach cultivated networks of mutual protection and support, creating a social ecosystem in which leaders and organizers could operate with greater security and effectiveness. In addition, the events surrounding Malcolm X's assassination and Bumpy's involvement emphasized strategic thinking within the community. Residents and leaders realized that achieving social and political goals required not just courage and ideology, but careful planning, situational awareness, and an understanding of local dynamics. This led to a more disciplined, intentional approach to activism and neighborhood organization, with safety and sustainability considered alongside goals and messaging. The psychological impact of knowing there were figures like Bumpy Johnson who could enforce boundaries and deter external threats cannot be overstated. It provided a sense of protection and confidence that allowed black leaders to speak out and organize without feeling completely exposed. Even though the formal structures of society often failed them, the community learned to leverage informal networks effectively to safeguard progress and lives. Over time, this dynamic influenced generations of Harlem leaders and activists. The lessons embedded in the promise about responsibility, accountability, and balancing power with ethics became part of the informal training for emerging community figures. It shaped not only how activism was conducted, but also how young leaders understood the interplay between risk, influence, and the well-being of their neighborhoods. Ultimately, the promise Bumpy Johnson made to Malcolm X became more than a private agreement. It became a symbol of the potential for strategic, responsible intervention to protect a community's leaders and its future. Its legacy is reflected in the sustained resilience of Harlem and similar urban communities, showing that the careful exercise of authority, when combined with solidarity and foresight, can have enduring, transformative effects on both activism and social cohesion. The legacy of the promise Bumpy Johnson made to Malcolm X continues to resonate in Harlem and the broader Black community even decades later. While the immediate impact was most visible in the 1960s, the principles underlying that promise, protection, responsibility, and strategic use of influence, have influenced how communities approach leadership and activism ever since. It demonstrated that real change required not only vision, but also practical safeguards for those leading the struggle. One key aspect of this legacy is the understanding that informal power structures can coexist with political movements to produce stability and resilience. Bumpy Johnson's role showed that influence doesn't have to be tied to official positions to have meaningful effects. His ability to protect Harlem and its leaders set a precedent for future generations, emphasizing that community-driven authority, when guided responsibly, can complement formal activism and amplify its impact. The promise also highlighted the importance of mentorship and intergenerational guidance, quietly safeguarding activists and mediating conflicts. Bumpy helped create an environment where young leaders could learn, organize, act without being paralyzed by fear. This established a culture of accountability and strategic thinking within Harlem that continues to shape local leadership approaches, from grassroots organizers to civic-minded community figures. Another element of the legacy is the symbolic power of trust and promises. Even though Malcolm X was ultimately assassinated, the commitment Bumpy made underscored the significance of personal honor and accountability in maintaining community cohesion. This idea, promises between leaders carry weight beyond words, has become part of the moral framework for how community leaders interact, resolve disputes, and protect those at risk. The events surrounding the promise also influenced how Harlem dealt with external pressures over the decades. Activists and residents learned that survival required careful navigation of both systemic oppression and local dynamics. They understood that protecting the community often involved alliances with unexpected allies, and that influence, when wielded responsibly, could be a tool for safeguarding progress rather than just asserting control. Culturally, the story of Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X has entered Harlem's collective memory as a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. It illustrates that leadership and influence are not solely about visibility or titles, but about action, responsibility, and the willingness to take risks for the community. This narrative continues to inform how history is taught, remembered, and celebrated within Black communities, reinforcing lessons about strategy, courage, and loyalty. Ultimately, the promise's legacy is enduring because it shows that individual actions, even behind the scenes, can have far-reaching consequences. It reminds us that power, when used wisely and ethically, can protect, empower, and transform a community. Harlem's resilience, the survival of its activists, and the continued reverence for figures like Malcolm X are all, in part, a reflection of that promise, quiet yet profound influence that continues to shape the Black community today.